how can others be reasonably expected to know your boundaries if you don't? If you don't know your own boundaries, how could I reasonably expect any other human being on the planet to know my own boundaries? And so my first thing, I think that the experts are not telling you about boundaries, because there's a lot of people out there, you need to tell everybody your boundaries, tell everybody your boundaries. Okay, great. But what about my own identification of what's happening within my own heart? What about my own deep work? What about my own wisdom? Because that's where wisdom begins, is when you know yourself. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time to tune in to our next episode of the Flourishing podcast. And I'm so excited here today to talk about boundaries. As a matter of fact, there's so much confusion today around boundaries, particularly in the workplace, but actually in all kinds of ways, that I want to spend the next few moments talking about 4 things about boundaries that the experts are not telling you. And why am I saying this here today? And why am I sharing this? Because I personally believe that there's a lot of confusion when we talk about this whole area of boundaries. Now, boundaries help you define what you're comfortable with and how it is that you would like to be treated by others. Now, of course, you have the right to define what you're comfortable with. You have the right to define how it is you would like to be treated by others. As a matter of fact, I strongly encourage you to take some time and define how you want to be treated, to define what you're comfortable with. And you know what? Boundaries actually apply to any type of relationship. When you think about it, of course, they apply in romantic relationships, but they certainly apply in friendships. Definitely, they apply in the workplace. They apply in our career, they apply in business, and they apply, of course, within our families and in every other area. Now, one of the things I've discovered as I've helped people and had conversations around boundaries is that there's a big difference between unhealthy boundaries and healthy boundaries. And so maybe we could just start talking about those differences here today for a couple of moments. I think that unhealthy boundaries put 100% of the focus on you. I also think that when you have an unhealthy boundary, it will actually decrease your mental health rather than increase it. I think that an unhealthy boundary keeps you feeling like a victim. It keeps you feeling disempowered. It prevents you from creating the life that you want. But when you have healthy boundaries, everything begins to shift. Of course, when you have an unhealthy boundary, the entire focus is on you. But when you have a healthy boundary, the focus is on us, because you recognize that the purpose of the boundary isn't so much to exclude and to push people away. The purpose of a boundary is to include and to create a safe space for all of us collectively to have that kind of relationship. I'll tell you what, healthy boundaries improve your mental health. And you know what? They take time to identify. It's not a quick thing. They take time and skill to communicate a healthy boundary, and it takes effort to regulate them. And there's no doubt that healthy boundaries take wisdom to calibrate. Now, when we talk about this idea of boundaries, I just want to say a couple of things before I share with you the 4 things that the experts are not telling you. The first about sort of boundaries that I think is so important is that boundaries flow fundamentally from self-confidence. When a person is lacking in self-confidence, I think you know this as well as I do, it becomes very difficult to have a healthy boundaries-oriented conversation. And I think that self-confidence has everything to do with the story that you're telling yourself about you, but also the story that you're telling yourself about the world. And so that person with unhealthy boundaries, when they're lacking in self-confidence, when they're telling themselves a negative story about themselves and about all the people around them, they're constantly on the defensive. They're not secure enough and comfortable enough in their own skin that they can actually have adult, professional, mature conversations. They're always defensive. They're always prickly. They're always kind of like Debbie Downer. But when you have a healthy sense of self-confidence, what happens is the entirety of your self-worth isn't caught up in this one conversation. The entirety of your self-worth isn't caught up in this one interaction or this one individual. You can actually be mature You can be at peace, you can have calm, you can be at rest because you know that on the inside of you, you have a deep well of self-worth. And you know what? You should. I'll tell you what, because you're awesome. I'll tell you, Eleanor Roosevelt said this. She said that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And I wonder, have you been consenting to people making you feel inferior? I hope that as a minimum, you set that as a personal boundary for yourself, that I will never allow anybody to make me feel inferior. And that starts with yourself. If you yourself are making yourself feel inferior, then no amount of counseling or coaching can help you. You've got to sort of draw the stake in the ground and decide what you're going to think about you. And I hope that you will think positive, you will think healthy, and you will think supportive. And if you're watching this video with somebody, just look at the person beside you and just say, hey, you are worth it. You absolutely have every right to a healthy sense of self-worth and a healthy sense of self-esteem. Now, here's the thing about boundaries. Boundaries impact every area of your life. As a matter of fact, I heard a psychologist describe boundaries like this. They said boundaries are where you end and where the other person begins. Now, that's kind of a weird, sort of statement, like where you end and where they begin, as if like we're such separate beings that it's like I'm just here in my complete universe and you're over there in your complete universe. I think there's some truth to that. I think I have to know where I end. In other words, what are my limits? Where is it that I'm willing to go? What will I tolerate? What will I allow? What kind of relationships will I permit within my life? And I also need to know where that other person begins. Because I think that everyone's talking today about, well, you need to respect my boundaries, but what about us respecting the boundaries of others? And I think if we have that kind of a focus where we're just focused on our own boundaries and never really thinking about the other person, then of course, obviously, we're going to find ourselves getting into trouble. And so I think that boundaries really do impact everything. And this is why I wanted to do this video here today, is because I actually think there's been so much talk about boundaries today that people have a lot of this conversation all wrong. A lot of people that you see out there talking about boundaries have no background in psychology. They have no background in coaching. They have no background in counseling. And they're just kind of spewing out sort of the flavor of the month. And I want to give you here today 4 things about boundaries that the experts are not telling you that I think are absolutely transformational, that will change your life. Let me go ahead and give you number 1. The very first thing is this. The experts are not telling you that you need to identify your boundaries. Listen, you need to identify your own boundaries. In other words, you have to do the deep heart work to understand yourself enough that you can figure out what your own boundaries are. Aristotle said this: knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And so I think that a lot of people are running around issuing trigger warnings to everybody around them, and yet they really haven't done the deep work to emotionally regulate. They haven't done the deep work to understand what's underneath the emotions that I'm feeling. Just because you get triggered or just because somebody says something that tweaks you the wrong way doesn't necessarily, it might mean that they violated your boundary, but it might also be God's way of showing you that you still have some work to do in the inside of your heart. And let me give you an example of this. The other day, somebody walked into the room and they said something to me and it bothered me. It really, really bothered me. Now, I'm happy that I learned enough that I didn't freak out over them, but if they were paying attention, they probably could have noticed that I was irritated by that. Now, I didn't say anything. I just kind of kept quiet. And again, I'm grateful for my growth, because back in the day, I would have said a lot, but I kind of held my tongue. But later, as in like the next day, when I had my reflective time with God, I actually said, why did what that person say bother me? Now, I could have flown off the handle and yelled at them and said, you violated my boundaries. You did this, you did that. You triggered me. And yet that would have been the dumbest response ever, if I can be honest. If I can invite you into my moment of self-awareness, I recognize that what they said was actually nothing to do with the trigger within my life, but I had not addressed my own trigger properly. So I want you to think of it like this. I had an untreated, unaddressed wound. And they, not knowing anything about that, came in and said something that triggered that wound, just like somebody, sticking on an open wound. Of course, it's going to hurt. But if they don't know it's a wound, well, then they're not violating a boundary because they're just being themselves. They're just operating in a place of kind of blissful ignorance. Whereas me sitting there wounded, it was like, oh, you violated my boundary. No. Oh, you triggered me. No. I need to get healed. You see, I think that a lot of the time people are not identifying where are the wounds in my life. Where are the things in my life? Maybe the negative perceptions, maybe the faulty blueprints, maybe the unhealthy programming. Frankly, friends, maybe it's just the unaddressed trauma and pain in your life, and you're walking around wanting everybody to bubble wrap you and coddle you, and that's okay. If you're a child, listen, I have a 6-month-old at home. Believe me, we coddle him. But when he's like 9 or 10, we're still going to hug him, but we're going to work with him differently. And when he's 19 and when he's 29, we're going to continue to expect that he will grow. You know, Lao Tzu said this is so powerful. He said, knowing others is intelligence, but knowing yourself is wisdom. You know, and I think that a lot of us, we put so much emphasis in Western culture in particular. That's where I grew up, so I can't really comment on others. But this culture, for sure, it's like, are you the smartest guy in the room? Are you intelligent? We actually have IQ tests where we measure people's intelligence, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But what if we started measuring like emotional intelligence, which is not like, you know, you being perfect, but emotional intelligence is do you have awareness of what the heck is going on in you? And so Lao Tzu, you know, thousands of years ago, offering ancient wisdom, said knowing others is intelligence. Okay, great. But what about knowing yourself? Because that's wisdom. And I think that for a lot of us, here's a question that I love to pose. How can others be reasonably expected to know your boundaries if you don't? If you don't know your own boundaries, how could I reasonably expect any other human being on the planet to know my own boundaries? And so my first thing, I think that the experts are not telling you about boundaries, because there's a lot of people out there, you know, you need to tell everybody your boundaries. Tell everybody your boundaries. Okay, great. But what about my own identification of what's happening within my own heart? What about my own deep work? What about my own wisdom? Because that's where wisdom begins, is when you know yourself. We believe that everyone should have the opportunity to work in a flourishing workplace. For so many, the workplace drains them and drags them down, rather than being a place where everyone belongs, everyone is valued, and everyone thrives. When you have a workplace like that, not only will it be positive, productive, and profitable, but you will be contributing to the mental health and well-being of every single person on your team. At Flourishing Workplace, we are changing the world by changing the workplace. Book a discovery call today and find out how we can help you create a workplace where everyone belongs, everyone is valued, and everyone thrives. The second thing I think the experts are not telling you about your boundaries is once you've done that heart work of identification, then you need to communicate. You know, and one of the things that I think is really crazy out there is, you know, like, listen, I have a hard enough time sometimes reading my own mind. And if you are honest with yourself, you could probably say the same thing. In other words, I often have a lot going on up here. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Like, a lot going on. And to really sort of tease out and understand my own thoughts, that takes a lot of work. And yet a lot of these people who are like, you know, running around talking about boundaries, it's like, well, you violated my boundaries. You violated my boundaries. And yet you didn't tell me what your boundaries were. And so how can you force me to read your mind? I mean, why not simply read your mind to me? In other words, communicate your boundaries. I can't read your mind. I'm having a hard enough time figuring out my own thoughts. And so how can I reasonably, or you reasonably, be expected to know what everybody else is thinking if you haven't done the work to properly communicate your boundaries? Listen to me, friends. Boundaries are completely ineffective when we don't communicate them. How can they be effective if we don't communicate them? And even under the law, if you don't have a do not trespass sign up, then you can't get somebody charged with trespassing because they do not know that they're on private property. It's not like they're walking around with this, mental GPS. Oh, I know I'm on Joe's property. Oh, I know I'm on Alice's property. Oh, this is Crystal's property. Listen to me. Even the law says you need to build a fence and you need to put a do not trespass sign on here. This is private property. And if you do that and then they continue to trespass on your private property, well, then you have the right to call law enforcement. And they come along and they say, hey, I'm going to deliver what's called a trespass notice. That's the legal notice that you have violated somebody else's boundary. And yet when it comes to relationships, we don't even think about that. We're just like, you triggered me. You violated my boundaries. Well, did you tell me what your boundaries were? Like I'm having a hard enough time just figuring out my own thoughts. You want me to read your mind too? Like explain to me how good that is going to go. Simon Sinek said this, and I think it's so important. He said, communication is not about speaking what we think. Communication is about ensuring others hear what we mean. Okay, those are two completely different things. I can sit there and be like, well, I'm just going to tell you what I think. All right. But wouldn't it make more sense to just slow down a little bit and ask, how do I ensure the other person actually hears what I mean? Those are two completely different things. And, communication is not, I'm talking at you. It's, I'm talking with you. And when I've shared from the heart, respectfully, professionally, with kindness, then being willing to listen to you respond and not make all kinds of judgments and assumptions about where you're coming from and who you really are. I've discovered this in my life. I've discovered it at times in my marriage. I've discovered it as a dad. I've discovered it in business. I've discovered it with business partners, is that a lack of communication actually breeds assumptions about what the other person is thinking. And I think you'd have to be an idiot to not know that assumptions are mostly always wrong. As a matter of fact, I heard a wise person say that when you assume, you make an ASS of both you and me, okay? And so what am I going to do? Run around living in the world of assumption? No. Why not live in the world of communication? How many think that is a stroke of genius right there? I'm no longer going to live in the role of assumption, in the world of assumption. I'm going to live in a world called communication. And George Bernard Shaw so wisely said this. He said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So I said what I thought, and I think that's communicating. That's not communication. Communication is two-way. So the experts, number one, are not telling you that you need to identify, you need to do the heart work. They're not telling you that. But they're also not telling you that you need to communicate, that communication needs to be two-way, that it's not just enough for you to go out there on social media and judge people and post these things, where you're just talking about how everybody's hurting you and everybody's doing this and doing that. That's not communication. That's a person who needs a therapist, okay? Communication is two-way. Communication is, can I share my heart? And boy, I would love to share and hear and understand your heart as well. So that's the second thing the experts aren't telling you. The third is in boundaries, and this one is really interesting. And I think this is a message no matter your age, no matter your culture, no matter sort of how you incline politically or financially or whatever. I think that the third thing that's so important the experts need to be telling you that they're not is to regulate. So number one is this idea of identify. Number two is communicate, but number three is regulate. In other words, I need to regulate my emotions. Now, a couple of moments ago, I told you about how, a few days ago, somebody walked into the room, they said something, I got triggered. I'm grateful to say that my emotions got triggered and I got tweaked, but I didn't, I didn't react. I didn't react in a way that was hurtful to the other person, because I knew that I needed to regulate my emotions. Now, here's the thing about emotions. Can I just talk about emotions for a moment? Your emotions aren't always completely accurate. Hate to break it to you. Just because you feel something doesn't mean that what you feel is actually reality. one of the best ways I have thought about emotions, and I've described this to thousands of people in hundreds of workshops and speaking forums and meetings, is that my emotions are like indicators on my dashboard. When I'm driving down the highway, my hair flowing in the breeze, looking for adventure, and I look down on my dashboard and I see my fuel gauge tells me that I'm almost empty. I don't sit there and start smashing my dashboard because it's telling me something I don't want to hear. I pull into a gas station and I solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is I'm almost out of gas. And the way to fix that is not to hammer the dashboard, it's to actually fill my tank up. Now, your emotions are like your dashboard. They tell you what's going on, but they're not actually what's going on. Okay. And so I could smash my dashboard and say, well, I don't want to hear that my fuel tank is almost empty, but I still have an empty fuel tank. And so what do I got to do? I got to fix the problem. What is underlying your emotion is your thoughts. Okay. So it works like this. I have an existing set of beliefs. I believe something to be true. It could be that I believe I'm worthless. It could be I believe you're worthless. It could be that I believe God loves me. It could be that I believe God hates me. It could be that I think that all human beings are good and kind and loving. And it could be that I think that all white people are bad. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like we all have underlying beliefs. And then layered on top of that is then how we think. And the crazy thing about our underlying beliefs is that a lot of us didn't ask for them. So this is where, again, back to that, like doing the hard work, like you were raised in an environment that downloaded a series of beliefs onto your soul. And you are walking around thinking you're this free thinking adult, but maybe you're not. If you haven't done the hard work, maybe you're a racist because somebody programmed you to be a racist. Maybe you have low self-esteem because somebody programmed you to have low self-esteem. Maybe you're walking around with insecurity because somebody violated you, and that insecurity is always there until you address the underlying beliefs. So I got beliefs, and then the thoughts on top of that, and then the emotions flow from that. And so, of course, it makes sense. If my underlying belief is I'm worthless, and then I'm constantly thinking I'm worthless, well, of course, I'm going to experience an emotion called anxiety. Does that surprise anybody? Of course not. I'm going to experience an emotion called depression. Does that surprise anybody? No. So is the problem how I feel? No. The problem is, what do I believe? What are my underlying thoughts? Listen to me. You don't have to control your thoughts. You just have to stop letting them control you. That's the key. I don't have to control my thoughts. That is an unbelievably liberating thought process right there. I don't have to control all my thoughts, but I've got to stop letting them control me. Just because I think it, just because I feel it, doesn't mean it actually is. The greatest weapon I have is my ability to choose one thought or another. And I'll tell you, if you've experienced trauma, if you've experienced hardship, if you've experienced pain, it's hard to do, but it's not impossible. Okay? It's not impossible. You just got to be more persistent than the pain. And you can do this. You got to get yourself into a healthy community. And so Viktor Frankl said between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So back to boundaries. Somebody comes in the room, they say something. Stimulus, like happened to me, like I was describing. And I'm sitting there and I have an opportunity to respond. There's a space between those things. That choice and the choice I make is the growth that I can experience in my life. And so a huge part of boundaries, I think, and when it comes to regulating, so part of boundaries is regulating yourself emotionally, not allowing yourself to be triggered by every Tom, Dick, and Harry, because they will trigger you. That's just welcome to humanity, friends. But I also think that part of regulating your emotions when it comes to boundaries is, yes, holding people accountable. So when somebody does violate a boundary, remember, let's follow the steps. I identify, then I communicate, So if I've identified my boundaries and I've communicated them, and then if you come along and violate the boundary that I have communicated to you, then yeah, absolutely. You better believe it. Regulating, part of that is holding you accountable. And that's not like, yelling at you and hitting you with a water gun. You know what I mean? That's not like going on social media and telling everybody what a horrible person you are. No, that's not regulating my emotion. That's being a child. Being an adult is sitting down with you and saying, listen, when you said this, when you did this, when you acted that way, you violated my boundaries. We had talked about that. Remember, just last week, I shared with you my boundaries and I said, look, that's not going to work for me anymore. And you agreed in that conversation that you would respect my boundaries, and today you didn't. Now I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt that you forgot or you made a mistake, but here's your opportunity to be accountable. And I want to ask you to apologize, and I want to ask you going forward, how are you intending to be? And if you intend to respect my boundaries, then I intend to stay closely connected to you and to give you the benefit of the doubt. But if you intend to not respect my boundaries, then I intend to cut you off. You see, notice how the cutting you off isn't the first step, okay? It's not like you violated my boundaries that I didn't even know, boundaries that don't really come from your heart because you didn't identify. I don't really know your boundaries. You don't really know your boundaries, but you just felt like getting triggered in the moment. No. That's not a mature way to handle it. A mature way to handle it is I've done the work, I've identified, I've communicated. Now I'm going to regulate. First, I'm going to regulate me. Secondly, I'm going to regulate you by holding you accountable if you violate those boundaries. And that takes me to the fourth thing the experts are not telling you, and that is this, that we need to recalibrate. Now, what do I mean by recalibrate? Here's what I mean. Albert Einstein said that the measure of your intelligence is your ability to change. And what I've discovered is that as I have grown, my boundaries also expand and shift and evolve. And so the boundaries I had when I was like starting in business many years ago are not the boundaries that I have today, because I've grown in my confidence. I've matured. I've become more self-aware. I've become more tapped in to what my true boundaries really are. And so I think that boundaries is not about a one and done process. Well, I set my boundaries back in the 1940s, Alice, and I'm going to hold people to it. How about you keep growing? How about you keep evolving? There's a Chinese proverb. I love this. It says the wise adapt themselves to circumstances as water molds itself to the pitcher. I love that. So the water's not expecting the pitcher would mold to it, but the water molds to the pitcher that holds the water. And many years ago, Henry Townson, actually one of the famous authors and true experts on boundaries, he said the definition of mental illness is demanding that the world adapts to me. But then he said the definition of mental health is being able to adapt to the world. And so are you sitting there demanding that everybody adapts to you? Or do you have that mental health approach that says, I can continue to adapt, I can emerge, I can be resilient? Because by the way, that's literally what the word resilient means. It means elasticity. It means the capacity to adapt. One has said that it actually means the ability to bounce back. So let me conclude, friends, and I hope that you've gotten something out of this. I'd love to hear your comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hey, if you disagree with what I'm talking about here today, let me know that too, because I am far from perfect. I'm just trying to share, after, 25, 30 years of coaching and counseling and working with people, 4 things about boundaries that definitely the experts are not telling you. Number 1, you got to identify. You got to do the heart work. The heart work. Number 2, you got to communicate. That's on you. Number 3, you got to regulate. Regulate your emotions, regulate when other people violate your boundaries, hold them accountable. You got to do that work. And then number 4, to just constantly be in a place where you are recalibrating. And so thanks for tuning in. You know what? I would encourage you, if you got a moment, to go to flourishingworkplace.com. And if you're listening to this and you're an executive or you're a leader or you got a team or you're a supervisor, or hey, you're just a solopreneur with maybe 1 or 2 folks working with you, I'd love for you to reach out to us. We would love to come and work with your team, your organization on boundaries. This is huge today because the workplace, some people's workplaces is wrecking their mental health, and other people's workplaces is completely building and supporting and empowering their mental health. Let's make sure that your workplace is doing the second thing, empowering, supporting, and building people's mental health. reach out to Flourishing Workplace today. Thank you so much.